And I went with the London Assurance because I felt that at this moment in time, we need to come to the theater to have our faith in humanity restored.
Welcome to the Director's Notes podcast. My name's Jovanni Sy. I'm the director and co-playwright of Salesman in China, which is opening on the Avon Theatre in August. And it is my honor to be here with the gentleman who programmed Salesman in China.
Hi, Jovanni, and I can't wait to see Salesman in China. It's like we've been reading the beautiful script that you and Leanna put together, and so it's opening soon. But today we're here to talk about London Assurance. I am Antoni Cimolino. I'm the director of London Assurance and the artistic director of the Stratford Festival, and it's great to be here with you, Jovanni.
Well, it's an honor to talk to you. I'm curious, at what point did you know or did you have an inkling that you wanted, A, to program London Assurance, and B, to direct it yourself?
Well, London Assurance is this singular, beautiful jewel from the 19th century. It was a very unusual creation, and it was written by a great theater impresario, playwright, a person who changed the history of playwrights, Dion Boucicault. And the play it was written by an 18-year-old. It was put together by a theater company. It's really a bit of a hybrid. It's delightfully funny. And not only that, it says some beautiful things about human nature, about our ability to change, our ability to have second chances. And so I was looking for a comedy to open late on the festival stage. And I thought this would be just the thing. It would be brilliant. And the company is wonderful. And I hope that it lives up to my dreams, that the director's good enough to make that happen.
Well, I'm so excited to see it because when I talk to some folks in your company, they always say two things. They describe it as very funny, and it's usually a word like wild or crazy, as if it somehow defies description or genre because it has a way of change. And maybe could you speak to that, the way it sort of subverts expectations along the way?
Sure. I won't. I'm not going to get too into the plot. You know that old story about restoration comedies, who is so smart to figure out the plot of a restoration comedy and who is so stupid as to care. So it's convoluted, absolutely. It's basically about a man of fashion, a person who is getting older, spent their whole life worrying about, society and how they look. And it's about them learning that there are other things in life. And it involves a plot with a young heiress and a group of people who go from the city to the country. So the London Assurance is like barefaced assurance, like your idea that you can just bluster your way through, and we find out that no, human decency and warmth and kindness are more important than just the force of society.
And it strikes me as a really interesting piece in that the way it bridges, restoration to Sheridan, and it's kind of before Wilde and Shaw, and there's something really interesting about that mid-18th century, wouldn't you find? Because it's a heightened kind of language, but it has elements of what we think of as almost naturalism. So do you find that an interesting challenge to find that sweet spot?
Yeah, you open the door to a million interesting things, and you're right. It's like we're doing Hedda Gabler and Ibsen, Shaw, Wilde, 1890s, 1885. And this was written in 1841. And he was, as I said, 18 years old. He looked to his hero, Oliver Goldsmith, and Richard Sheridan, the playwright you just mentioned, who wrote in the latter part of the 18th century. So he was looking at models that were 50, 75 years earlier for this first play that he wrote. And it's delightful. I mean, the situations are beautiful that they come up with. They're surprising, but they pull from an older tradition. And his life changed after this. I mean, he became the greatest producer of the 19th century, usually doing things that were like social dramas, sensational. In a time without television, film, he would create beautiful realism on the stage. Like one of his plays had him, he was also an actor, as in addition to being a playwright, jumping into a beautiful big pool of water under moonlight. And it was done with fabric and in something like our Richard II last year with a jetted pool. So but people were blown away by this stuff. He introduced the matinee performance. Before this guy, there were no matinee performances.
Oh, wow.
There were an evening would have several things on stage, and you could pay half price at 9:30 to come in for the second half. He got rid of that. So he would, after him, it was one play that you would come to. He introduced and gained acceptance for ownership of plays by playwrights and royalties.
Oh.
So before him, there would be one payment made for the whole run. And once you, as a playwright, had released and received that payment, you had no further rights in that play. And it was Boucicault who changed that.
Wow.
And among, if that was enough, he even invented fireproof scenery. I mean, the guy was amazing.
Did that as an 18-year-old.
Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible.
And that's how he started, in a very unlikely situation. But yeah, he started as an 18-year-old writing this play.
Oh, I see. Okay. And was he Charles or Richard in the original?
He wasn't an actor in the company, although he was an actor. He wrote this play and it needed work. And it got that work from a company of actors. So it is very much the production of it's a collective without, before that word was really commonly used. And it's stronger for it. You can feel the imprint of the acting company at the Covent Garden at the time.
And maybe this pivots nicely to the next question. In the way you approach the comedy of the piece, how much are you drawing on improvisation or input from your company of actors to create those, the wonderful latsies or the bits?
It's very much a collective creation. We'll open up and we'll have a discussion. Usually rehearsals begin with a discussion about where we're at, how we're doing, what has been achieved, what's yet to be achieved, what the playwright was intending, and then a look at, how we can modify the business. And, I keep on going back to, we have runs, but I believe that it's not good to run things that aren't too often, the things that are not yet done. So we always go back, we work and work and work and take input from the company.
Great.
Jovanni, this was a really interesting piece in the sense that London Assurance, because not only was it this first play by this playwright, but it is the first play in history that had a box set. So before this play, actors would walk into the stage house just coming in from the wings. This play instead introduced doors. So you'd suddenly have to open a door to come in. Wow. And it had real carpets, real chairs. It was like absolutely in a proscenium arch. It was the definition of what would become 19th century theater, with a kind of realism that was, made up of real plants, real furniture, real doors. Right. So to take that play and to do it on the festival stage is, some would say, an act of perversion. But it's delightful because it really changes the dynamics of it and opens the play up. Also, I feel like the festival stage provides more humanity and more, there's a kind of two-dimensional quality to a proscenium arch, which you can defy. You're doing a play about putting on a play. And that's why we thought the Avon would be perfect, because it's an empty box that you fill with, at a theater like the Avon, the ability to do a side straight out is very straightforward. In a theater like the festival stage, which the audience surrounds the action on stage, it's a more dynamic and complicated process. But it is really opening up the play. It gives it more humanity. I guess it's hard to find another word. More vulnerability. Your
play's full of asides, and how do you kind of negotiate the kind of concept of privacy or complicity with the audience when it's that kind of round configuration? I'm just curious.
Once the convention is established, I make sure that the actors it always drives me nuts when an actor does an aside to the audience in a thrust stage with the audience that's closest to them, because basically it closes off everybody else. And so I encourage them to be as open and bald as possible, because once you establish the convention that the person you're talking to doesn't hear your asides, then you can just have a conversation with the rest of the room and then get back to the conversation you're having with that person.
Yeah, speaking of establishing these conventions, I mean, in a play like yours where, it's so dependent on mistaken identity, wild coincidence, how do you negotiate that sweet spot between there's always that plausibility gap, and you have to, as you said, if you're worried about the plot of restoration comedy, you're at the wrong show. But
Yeah.
you know how if it goes too far, it falls into that area of contrivance. So stretching the limits of credulity, but not kind of losing your audience because they go, oh, this is too much. I can't follow you now.
Right. Well, we try to keep the acting style rooted in a verisimilitude, like it feels people are talking in a very natural way, until that thing happens where suddenly their jaws drop. These situations in the play are very much about real life. I mean, it's about a society concerned with money, concerned with fashion, concerned with and about relationships. And it's a sentimental comedy, which means that there is forgiveness in it. It is unlike Molière. Many of the same company were in the production of The Miser that I did a couple of years ago. And in The Miser does not change. He does not have the ability to break out of that Roman character type that he is. Mm-hmm. And we know a lot of people are like that. Like, they just can't change. In this, Sir Harcourt Courtly has the ability he gets awareness. And in that awareness, he gets a second chance. And that's true for many people in the play. And, it's interesting, in Shakespeare's career, he went from writing tragedies where Lear and Othello cannot change. Mm. They try to, they struggle to, they may have realizations, but they are stuck as tragic heroes in the situation that they're in. Later in his life, in plays like Cymbeline, which are doing this season, or The Winter's Tale, characters actually are given the opportunity for a second chance. That second chance comes from chance. And in our lives, we are constantly surrounded by coincidence, chance, random. It's what you do with those situations that really dictates your future. But the randomness of existence is a given.
It's funny. What I find so fascinating about your play is that the characters like Sir Harcourt, Lady Gay Spanker, like Grace, they fall into those easily recognizable archetypes, the fop, the ingenue. But like you say, there's a depth of humanity, almost, I don't want to say a psychological verisimilitude that you kind of maybe associate with a later period, but I feel like I understand them, that they're more drawn out, they're more fleshed out than an early, like a Restoration kind of fop character.
I think that's true. I think that's right. Like, each one of them, even if they're trapped in certain ways of behaving, like Grace, the young heroine, is somebody who's become quite jaded about the possibility of marriage. She figures, I got to do it. It's a commercial transaction. I got to get it over with, and who cares? And then eventually she falls in love and breaks. Oh boy, I'm really spoiling the play for everyone. But she breaks out of that mold, and you understand why she felt the way she did, and you can see the change to the new her. And so I think you're right. In all the cases, you sort of understand the characters. They're not just a two-dimensional thing,
Yeah. I'm curious, to what degree do you have an image of the last production that Brian Bedford directed, because it had such an extraordinary cast? I didn't get a chance to see it, but like how is that etched, and does it inform anything that you do?
Yes, of course. Brian was a great mentor and friend, and I had the privilege of directing Brian and working with him as an actor, and enormous respect. And it is almost an homage to that production that I decided, getting on to 20 years later, to remount this play. He did it at the Avon, and he did it with Desmond Healy, who was a designer who could create magic out of masking tape and pool noodles. Yeah. And so very much the effect on the Avon stage was traditional cross arch, trompe-l'oeil. Like, you look at the stage and you think it's something entirely different than what it is when you get up close to it. By doing it on an open stage, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to then do it in the Festival Theatre, it's a departure from that. Not a departure from the joie de vivre and the I hope the wit and the energy that Brian always insisted upon in any production that he did. But it is a departure stylistically in terms of the representation of the play. However, Brian always kind of made it clear that boredom was not something that was allowed on stage. People didn't pay money for it. And he took his comedy very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think that I learned a lot from him, and hope I'm continuing the kind of rigor and exactness that's needed to make a comedy work.
And what kind of challenges did you have with your design collaborators in terms of, putting it in that open configuration on the festival?
Yeah, because there's a lot of scene changes, and as the acts go on, and that is trickier on especially if you're only doing one interval. So this play would have had 4 intervals.
Right.
So by doing one, then you have to transform the stage in front of the audience's eyes, which is also an opportunity for kind of theatricality. So that was very much part of the considerations with Lorenzo Savoini, who's the set designer, and Francesca Callow, who's a costume designer, was how do we translate this to a thrust stage where it is more open? So there are challenges for the actors, there's challenges for the design team as well. The great thing about a thrust stage is that it is a more conscious act of theater going. So in other words, rather than the lights going down and everybody staring in one direction and the lights come up on a box, it predates film, this idea that you suddenly believe that thing at the end of the room where the sightlines are very controlled is a reality, and you ignore the reality around you. In a thrust stage, you're sometimes looking across the stage at other audience members. So there's a real sense of a conscious theater going, that you don't pretend what's happening on any level internally is real, beyond a kind of conscious level of, I am watching a play with a whole bunch of other people and we're looking at each other watching the play, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that settings for that kind of work need to be very, very evocative but light.
Right.
And so we have created a London townhouse on Belgrave Square through tables, chairs, curtains, carpets. We then go to outside of a country estate, and suddenly there's plants everywhere, and just this sense of greenery and expanse. And so the first act is more constricted, it's tighter, and the lighting's very controlled. It's early morning in this narrow townhouse. The second act opens up into this beautiful open floral area in front of this old country manor. And then in the third and fourth act, we go inside of that country manor. So then we're into furniture, hunting, trophies, just that sense of a 19th century house.
Right.
And it's fun to see that transformation all on Tanya Mozejevich's beautiful thrust stage.
Right. It's funny. What you're describing is one of the things I really appreciated about your production of Grand Magic last year. A different thrust, but still a thrust configuration, but the nimbleness with which you could get from an outdoor palazzo to an indoor kind of setting to and the power of relying on our imagination to fill in the details, and the magic of seeing it transform before your eyes. I think it was really exciting to see, and it felt very full, even though it was actually it wasn't cluttered with objects, but it had a sense of fullness to it.
Yeah, the thing about a thrust stage is that it gives you the opportunity to lightly decorate it. And it is a thing. It is a thing that is then added to. Whereas a proscenium arch stage becomes an empty space that you fill, right? And so in doing Salesman in China, again, a beautiful play about putting on a great play, that gives huge opportunities, because then you can contrast how you fill one room, how see a play within a play. On a thrust stage, all the stuff about putting on a play within a play becomes much harder. Mm-hmm. And there's many plays about putting on a play within a play. Mm-hmm. And so translating that to a thrust is always a challenge, because in essence, what you're creating on a thrust stage is you are inviting the audience to imagine a world. And the less you do, kind of the better. It's one of the reasons why Tyrone Guthrie insisted on creating the thrust stage at Stratford in 1953. That kind of stage had not existed since Shakespeare's time. Mm-hmm. And as Molière said, all you need to create drama is 2 planks and a passion. And so by creating an open, empty stage, once again, he felt that it allowed Shakespeare's effects, which were created through the imagination and language, to be realized. Whereas on a proscenium arch stage where you have to fill in the picture, you have to make choices about what is in that space. Not doing anything is not an option, if that makes sense. So for Shakespeare especially, the idea that you allowed the poetry and, ill met by moonlight, proud Titania, tells you so much. It tells you that they're not happy to see each other. You realize the name of the person that's being spoken to. You realize the moon is out. You realize she's proud, all within one line. Mm-hmm. And to start creating the phases of the moon on a stage is to not only redo Shakespeare's work, but to actually undermine Shakespeare's work. So it's not to say you can't do Shakespeare on a proscenium arch. It's just not as good.
I'm curious about your own journey as a director. At what point did you already know you wanted to direct? Was it as in your early days in the company, or was it as far back at Windsor? Like, when did you have the sense that you were going to be doing this?
I'm a Sudbury, Ontario kid. I'm a Northern Ontario kid, and I went to school for theater at the University of Windsor. And in the summers, I would come back to Laurentian University, and for a number of years, I ran a theater company the first year, and then I came back and I directed that company for the next couple of years. And we would perform in parks, and we would work outdoors. And so we did Shakespeare, Molière, Commedia dell'arte, and Chekhov, comedies, farces. And we were able to do those outdoors. So I was fortunate. I got a chance to actually lead a company, and I learned about that. And so then I was always interested in directing. And within a couple of years at the festival, I was asked to be an assistant director, which at the time, Jovanni, I took as a comment on the quality of my acting. And I was, probably right. But anyway, I've never looked back. Directing's great. You get to work with so many people, and there's so many variety of problems. I think the only thing better than being a director is being a playwright, and you get to do both.
It's because I can't keep a job down, I think. But you mentioned Brian Bedford as a mentor. Were there other people who had a formative, who just helped you become the director you are in those early years?
Well, Richard Manette, who was our longtime artistic director and was a bit of a hero for me when I was young, because I just thought he was a fantastic performer and director, and his the joy in his productions. He was not remotely interested in a kind of gritty realism. He believed theater was there for joy and escape and the realization of more profound truths. So emotion was a big part of his work, but so was comedy and joy. And he gave me great opportunities, so I'm incredibly indebted to him. Bill Hutt, who was one of our greatest actors here, and was privileged to be able to direct Bill and work with him and watch him work. Just his sense of power, of commitment, of showmanship. There were Martha Henry, of course, who was a great friend and wonderful director, brilliant actress. Was someone who I'd learned a lot from, but there's many, many others. And it's a great thing about the Festival Theatre is the Festival Company is because we work together for 9 months, year after year in many cases. You get to know people. You get to learn from them. You get to watch. And so it's not like many theaters, great companies, sometimes will have a company of actors who come back, but often it's like this group is here for 8 weeks, and then we get another group, and so as human beings, we learn through time, through relationships, through watching, hearing, listening. And if you're playing Hamlet, and you got 4 weeks, and you have a cold, your Hamlet becomes about that cold. Over 9 months, a lot can happen. A parent can die. There's life happens over that period of time, as well as a greater time to gestate and think. But it informs the work on our stages. A play that we maybe went into previews in early May will be very different by November.
Right. And I think the other thing about the festival that I've observed as a first-timer here is that incredible sense of legacy and continuity. You are a bridge to Richard Manette for some of the younger performers, but he was a bridge for you to the generation before him. So, and by the time you're around doing your Hamlet, it's almost like the wisdom of the earlier Hamlets kind of filters down towards people, it seems. There's that wonderful osmosis within the company.
That is true. That's true. I mean, I played Laertes to Stephen Wilmet's Hamlet. Douglas Rain played my dad, Polonius, and a whole bunch of other people. Peter Donaldson, Tom McCamus, wonderful actors. Rolly Hugel, just incredible artists. Bill Hutt in that company. So when I directed Hamlet with Jonathan Goad, you carry all that with you. You pass it on. Theater changes. It evolves over time, and that's wonderful. Learning is something that we build on past practice. To completely get rid of and start from, the Stone Age, it seems to me to be not the way to go. I think there's an important thing, and you can decide what you like, what you don't like. Often our greatest learning comes from a reaction to stuff that we don't like. Mm-hmm. And that's important. Mm-hmm. So you got to have something there to deviate from.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like in improv, the yes and attitude is sort of, you take what is useful to you, you build on it, and sometimes you respond to that, which you have a strong aversion to. One of Liana's first plays was a reaction to a play she had that strong aversion to. She had seen David Mamet's Liana, and her first play, The Vic, I think was her response play, as she calls it, because she was just so provoked by it.
Right.
In that good
right.
way that prompts you to do something else.
And you can be sure Mamet was responding to previous influences, both in style and in substance. That's right. So it's good to, it helps you figure out what you believe in and who you are.
For sure.
Yeah. How's it going on Salesman in China?
It's supposed to be about your play. It is going wonderfully. No, I am so excited. And as you say, being in the Avon is the perfect place because we are a box in a box. I mean, our set is almost a bit like Coriolanus is in that it's that, it's a box in the box. So it has that extra meta feeling of being like you're looking at a maquette, at a designer maquette, which is kind of perfect for what we're saying. So,
beautiful.
Yeah.
And that is so interesting about those theater traditions, because theater, of course, would have started in a theater much like the Festival Theater 24 centuries ago, at least one tradition of theater. There's, many different traditions. But by about the 19th century, this idea of creating things within this controlled box, which became a definition of what we think of as theater for many years and would have been, certainly in Salesman in China, Arthur Miller's kind of view of it would be creating reality within that limited scope. Mm-hmm. And it's just fascinating that we kind of distilled reality to that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in translating a play that it was written for that kind of reality to a more open stage, which we're doing on London Assurance, you all of a sudden realize that everything from the timing of things, because you're not just entering through a door, you're having to come through a long hallway, to the asides, to, how you decorate the set, the feeling of the room. And also comedy is very directional. Mm-hmm. I mean, comedy is, you often need to see a person's face to be able to understand what's going on and if they're cracking a joke. Mm-hmm. And therefore, comedy within the Festival Theater is always a challenge. I remember Bill Hutt had the ability to crack a line, a punchline, and turn and do the entire audience. Yeah. I remember Nicky Pennell, a great actor, he came to our theater school, and he talked about a line change that had happened to a Shakespeare play where the line, like an ill-roasted egg all on one side, was changed to like an ill-roasted egg half-baked, and it was never getting a laugh. And it was Nicky's theory that Shakespeare had written a line that ended with the actor smiling all on one side.
Oh.
You got the fact that it was a joke in part from what the actor was doing and what their face was doing. And he had written that, as Shakespeare does in so many things. He puts stage directions right into the writing, that whoever changed the line had screwed up the comedy. But that depends on a person actually not seeing the back of that actor's head, which often in the Festival Theater they do.
Right.
So all of these things take negotiation and translation, which is a great part of what Salesman in China is about.
Right. A lot of your descriptions of what appeals to you of these productions you've mentioned is that sense of heart and humanity. Is that kind of tied into what you're hoping people take away from London Assurance? Is like, if there's something that you're hoping people walk away with, what would that be?
That's a great point. It's why I fell in love with Salesman in China immediately when I read it, because it had such heart and humanity. And I feel like we're in a special time in human history, not a good time. It's very unlike the 80s and the 90s, where the Berlin Wall came down and all of a sudden there was no reason to have a military for a few years there. We now are arming. We're feeling the skies are darkening. There is an exclusionary feeling about the other, and everybody is hunkering down to their own, it's us versus them.
And mistrust in institutions we always believed in, like the rule of law, justice systems. Yeah, it's
all
a
of that.
Scary time.
Right? The theater right now needs to be there to allow us to examine what it means to be human, not to pull back from it. But I think that it is especially a time for us to learn about the ability of humanity to adapt, to be forgiving, to be generous, to be kind. And many of these plays cover that. So, I love Ben Jonson. I do many of his, I've directed quite a few of his plays, but he was very brittle and kind of censorious. And so at one point I was weighing a Jonson versus the London Assurance, and I went with the London Assurance because I felt that at this moment in time, we need to come to the theater to have our faith in humanity restored. And that's an important function. The theater brings community together. You may not have a community when you start the play at 8 o'clock. By 11 o'clock, you've figured out a lot about each other and what you all value together. So I feel like in putting together this playbill this year and in looking at next year, that we need things that inspire us, that give us courage, that give us hope. And so both London Assurance and Salesman in China, I hope, do that.
It's wonderful. It feels too like post-pandemic, we almost need to learn how to reform community too. We've gotten out of the practice of being together. So yeah, I love hearing what you have to say. Anything that makes me want to commune again, to feel joy with other people again instead of in my silo.
Right. And we've gotten used to getting into our slippers and jammies and putting on a streaming service. And the theater asks that we go out and we sit beside other people. We sit with them, that we laugh together, perhaps cry together, that we go through the sticky but ultimately much more rewarding experience of being with other people. And in a world where our devices and our world as a whole, everything from how our homes take care of us, to how our cars take care of us, to how our devices insulate us, it's like we're striving towards a world that doesn't doesn't move our hair or force us to get beyond ourselves. The theater asks us to come together, and let's do it for a reason that makes us charge out of there and want to change the world for the better. Thank you for this, Jovanni.
Oh, thank you so much.
And thank you for doing Salesman in China. I think there's another podcast about that coming up.
There is.
Good.
Thank you. Like I said, it's about the creation of the play is really a metaphor for how do we all get along? How do we all do something together when there's baggage between us, when there's misunderstanding, maybe mistrust? What I hope is that they get a sense of hope